I'm going to introduce the speakers briefly in reverse order. So our discussant is Sinéad Murphy, and she's she works for the Society for Research into Higher Education. But in her spare time, she's a researcher on comparative literature, especially on Middle Eastern sci-fi, which is why she's got the short straw and ended up being the discussant. And Arab futurisms. She's a member of the Beyond Gender Research Collective.
Okay. I think.
If you're on Zoom.
All right. Yeah. But you can keep trying. I mean, you can try and get internship. I mean, we get internships, that's amazing, right?
It's easier on Zoom. What's going on? Eradicate that person.
I think.
Thank you. Okay.
Is it?
Yeah. Sounds a little bit ragged. We
is
haven't
it a
done
job,
this for a while. She works for the Beyond Gender Research Collective on gender, sexuality, and queer science fiction. So that's our discussant. And our speaker, I'm delighted to introduce Ha-Joon Chang, who is now at SOAS. If you read the Daily Mail, they got it wrong. He doesn't work at Cambridge anymore. He's moved to SOAS, and he is an old friend. We go back a long way, and I've watched his career flower and bloom, and with just awesome progression. He's published 16 authored books, 5 of them co-authored, 11 edited books. The one that really brought him to a lot of people's attention was a book called Kicking Away the Ladder. And I've watched him present this to delegates of the World Trade Organization and create almost like an insurrection at the WTO as developing country delegates realized that they were being fed a pack of lies about the history of the now developed countries and their trade policies. Other books include Bad Samaritans, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, and Economics, the User's Guide. But he's got a book out next week, Edible Economics, and I've got a copy and you can't have it. And it was in the Daily Mail. I mean, you can't get better promotion than being denounced by the Daily Mail for wokery because he had the temerity to say that the full English breakfast is not really English. And so that was this week's big story. There's some stuff about trust and Kwarteng, but that was the big story this week. And that'll be published next week. And it's going to be Book of the Week on Radio 4, if anybody's interested. His writings have been translated and published in 44 languages, 46 countries. His books have sold, and anybody who writes books, please look away now. His books have sold over 2 million copies. He's the winner of the 2003 Gunnar Myrdal Prize and the 2005 Wassily Leontiev Prize. So could you please welcome Ha-Joon Chang.
Thank you. Yeah, Duncan's very easy to buy. You know, I give him a free copy of the book, and he gives me that kind of introduction. So, it's my great. So what do I say?
Just say that.
No. Right. Yeah. I'm very happy to be here. I'm told that I'm the first live speaker in the LSE program in 2 years. So I'm very flattered. I've been a long friend of the LSE Development Studies program since when I was in Cambridge. Now that I've moved closer, I hope to be in more interaction with LSE. Now, today's talk is a bit of a kind of unusual subject, even for me, because I mean, talk about a lot of strange things, but let's call this a stranger thing, economics versus science fiction. Economists are notoriously unimaginative people, while the writers and the readers of science fiction tend to reside at the opposite, at the end of the creativity spectrum. So you may think this is a bit of an odd pairing, but I think a greater interaction between the two fields can improve both fields, thereby ultimately enhancing our understanding of the world. Before, however, I get into the main theme of this lecture, which is the interaction between the two fields, let me first point out that much of economics, especially but not exclusively, neoclassical economics, which is the dominant school of economics these days, is science fiction in two senses. Yeah? First of all, many economists have believed in the fiction that they are practicing science. The classical economists like David Ricardo talk about iron laws of economics. Yeah? So implying that this is the immutable laws like what you find in the natural sciences like physics and chemistry. Karl Marx styled himself as an advocate of scientific socialism, trying to distinguish himself with the other socialists who he denounced as utopian. Today, most neoclassical economists operate with the notion that economics is a science. They are at pains, first of all, to separate what they call normative economics from positive economics. Yeah? So normative economics is where value judgment, whether ethical or political, is involved. Yeah? Positive economics is where those are not present, and therefore can be practiced like natural sciences, especially physics. We say that many economists have physics envy. Moreover, the neoclassical economists are very cocky about the scientific progress that they have allegedly achieved. So a very good and embarrassing example is Robert Lucas, the Chicago economics professor who is also a winner of the so-called Nobel Prize in economics. I say so-called Nobel Prize because it's not a real Nobel Prize. It's a prize given by the Swedish Central Bank in memory of Alfred Nobel. So actually, at one point, the Nobel family was trying to make the Swedish Central Bank to drop the name because they were arguing the Swedish Central Bank was giving prizes to all these right-wing economists whose values do not conform to the values of Alfred Nobel. Yeah? Anyway, that's another story. So Robert Lucas became the president of the American Economic Association in 2003. And in the address, he proudly announced that the problem of, and I'm quoting, the problem of depression prevention has been solved, end of quotation. This was 2003, only 5 years later, the global economy had the biggest financial crisis and economic depression since the Great Depression of 1929. But never mind that, economists, neoclassical economists will, most of them will insist that at least the positive part of economics is science. So that's one sense in which economics is a science fiction. Another sense in which it is science fiction is that most economists believe, at least implicitly, that progress in science and technology is going to, or at least can, solve virtually all economic problems. So especially free market economists will say give people the right incentives, by cutting taxes, like what this government is trying to do. People will come up with the necessary technologies to solve any economic problems we face, be it climate change or the access to water or whatever. It's not just neoclassical economics that things like that. Karl Marx and many of his followers imagine the world in which science and technology are so advanced that capitalism is abolished and people can, and I'm quoting Marx, hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner. I wonder what they were criticizing, probably the dinner they were eating. Yeah, because that Marx wrote this when he was in England. Of course, these views are highly misleading. First of all, the view that economics is a science is downright wrong. It is not simply that government regulate the economy based on ethical and political considerations rather than pure economic considerations of efficiency or productivity. So, for example, a lot of countries will have universal service requirement for certain basic services. Like if you are running the postal service, you have to deliver to every place at the same price so that even people living in remote area will have access to postal service. A lot of countries that cap the prices for essential services like energy, even this country. But it's more than that, because the very definition of economic actors and markets have ethical and political foundations. So for example, before the rise of capitalism, people did not exist as free contracting individuals. They all existed as members of some community. So the individualistic assumption about behind the neoclassical economics is very era specific. For another example, today we may take it for granted that corporations are a separate legal person, separate from the shareholders. But in the 19th century, when this was instituted, a lot of people objected to the idea. So who are the market actors that even is a political definition? Neoclassical economics believes markets to be natural and impersonal things, but they are fundamentally political and even ethical construct. So to illustrate that point, was it? This has frozen. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so in my earlier book, I talk about child labor. In the
Right.
that's right. Late 18th, early 19th century, with the start of the Industrial Revolution, child labor became a huge problem. Of course, poor children had always worked, but they were doing children's work. They were, I don't know, taking care of the family goat, take care of their younger siblings, collect firewood, collect water, whatever. Yeah? But with the start of the Industrial Revolution, machines came along, and now you didn't need the muscle power of fully grown adults to operate the kind of the factories. Huh? So actually, at the time, they even built the small machines, especially designed for children. Yeah? So a lot of children work in the factories and coal mines and so on, and I mean, they died in large numbers. Yeah? I mean, these were dangerous. Especially in the excuse me, cotton factories, the dust that came from the textile manufacturing process would settle in the workers' lungs and cause the very dangerous lung diseases. And if the worker happened to be a child, oh, thank you. That the disease would even prevent the lungs from growing. So a lot of children died in factories. So there was a campaign to regulate child labor. And finally, in 1819, a group of the reformist MPs tabled this regulation on child labor, which by today's standard was a joke. Yeah. So first of all, it was said that we are going to regulate child labor, not abolish it. Yeah? And we are going to define we are going to ban child labor only for very young children below the age of how many? 8. Yeah. And from 9 to 16, after which they were considered adults, they would be allowed to work up to how many hours a day? 12. Yeah. Yeah, this is a time when adults were working 15, 16 hours. Yeah. So 12 was considered light. Yeah. And they said we are going to regulate this only in cotton factories. Yeah. Not other factories, not coal mines, nothing else. Yeah. Because cotton factories were the most dangerous places. Yeah? Even then, there was an uproar. Yeah? A lot of people said this is trying to undermine the very foundation of a free market economy, namely freedom of contract. Yeah? These children want to work. These people want to hire them. What is your problem? Yeah? It's not like these factory owners kidnap these children and use them as slave laborers. No, they voluntarily want to work for these factories. So preventing that is undermining the very foundation of a free market economy. Today, even the Tory government doesn't argue like that. Yeah, I mean, in their dash for growth, Truss and Kwarteng or ex-Kwarteng, didn't argue that we need to bring back child labor so that we can have maximum efficiency and maximum growth. Why? Basically, because our ethical values have changed. Yeah? We have come to accept that the right of children to have a childhood, have education, to have the playtime is more important than the freedom of contract. And once you accept that, there's no more question. Yeah? The labor market itself is defined by this ethical consideration. Yeah? The fact that markets are political and ethical constructs also confirms my assertion about the second sense in which economics is a science fiction, namely that it's believed that scientific progress will ultimately solve all economic problems. If markets have political and ethical foundations, economic problems will not disappear, even with sufficient progress in science and engineering, as political and ethical disagreements will never disappear unless you live in, not working again. This is okay. Well, yeah. Unless you live in this world where dissent is completely abolished. Yeah? Indeed, as I'll discuss later, many science fiction writers imagine worlds in which scientific progress has made people miserable, or even have destroyed their very humanity in one way or another. So scientific progress, technological progress cannot be a solution to economic problems, because the definition of economic problems itself is political and even ethical. Now, saying that much of economics is science fiction in the negative sense doesn't mean that the relationship between the two has to be negative. And in this the lecture, I would like to argue that both science fiction and economics can benefit from greater interaction with each other. First of all, science fiction writers could do with more solid understanding of economics. This is a brilliant science fiction novel called Bring the Jubilee by the American writer Ward Moore. It is brilliant in its own way, but it failed to convince me, because the alternative future in this novel starts from the premise that the South won the American Civil War. But why is it not convincing? Well, contrary to what most people think, the American Civil War was more about the country's economic development strategy than slavery as an ethical issue. You know, Abraham Lincoln thought the blacks were racially inferior. He, didn't agree with enslaving them, but he thought these people should ideally all go back home, somewhere in Africa. Well, according to the Sarah Palin, Africa is a country, so you know where they are from. The early economic development strategy of the US was actually determined by the then economically more powerful South, because they were the main engine of US export economy, exporting cotton and tobacco using slave labor. At one point, cotton and tobacco together accounted for something like 68% of American export. So the South was the economic engine. So in this environment, it was very difficult for American manufacturers to grow, because the South wanted to have free trade, export their agricultural products and import manufactured products from Europe, which are not only better, but also cheaper, even considering the considerably high transportation cost of the time, because the American manufacturing industry was very unproductive at the time. However, some people argue that this is not how the country should move forward. This guy, Alexander Hamilton, the very first finance minister, or what they call Treasury Secretary of the United States of America, argued that in a country like the economically backward country like the United States, the government needs to protect and nurture its young industries until they grow up and can compete with the more advanced the producers from richer countries. This idea is known as the infant industry argument. Hamilton tried to argue this But initially, it fell upon deaf ears. Sorry, deaf ears. That what am I saying? Because yeah, this is the hip hop musical Hamilton. So people like Thomas Jefferson would argue that, look, this guy is crazy. Huh? I mean, why should we subsidize inefficient Yankee manufacturers? Huh? We want free trade. Huh? Now, Hamilton dies in a pistol duel with this guy, Aaron Burr, in 1804, when Hamilton was the ex-finance minister and Burr was the serving vice president. He dies in a pistol duel with Burr. Yeah, this was wild times because the serving vice president shoots the ex-finance minister dead, and no one goes to the prison. Huh? So Hamilton died in 1804, but after the 1812 to 1812 the Anglo-American War, so far the first and the last time in which the U.S. mainland was invaded, a lot of Americans came to agree with Hamilton. Unless we develop our manufacturing industry, we are not going to be able to defend ourselves in a future war like this. Yeah? So Americans started shifting in that direction, and of course that posed a lot of conflict between the North and the South. Yeah? The North wanted protectionism, the South didn't want it. So if you look at the history of the US at the time, depending on which party is in power, the tariff rate goes up and down like hugely. Yeah? And finally, it all came to a head in the American Civil War. Yeah? And in that war, the South was eventually defeated by the North. They seem to have the upper hand in the beginning, but in the end, it couldn't sustain its advantage because basically, it didn't have the material basis to win that war. And you don't need kind of economic historian to tell you this. Yeah, this guy, Red Butler, in Gone with the Wind, he summarizes this point in just one paragraph. Yeah? So basically, he's saying that, look, we are going to lose. Yeah? Because we don't have any industrial capacity. Yeah? We don't have a cannon factory. Yeah? We don't build ships. We have very few foundries. Yeah? How are you going to win the war? Yeah? The North had these things because of decades of sporadic but protectionism. Yeah? The South, according to the Red Butler, all it had was cotton, slaves, and arrogance. Yeah? Yeah, so in this kind of setup, even as a science fiction, supposing that the North was defeated in the war is very unconvincing. Huh? So I hope that the better economic understanding by science fiction writers would make the science fiction better. But I think that the main beneficiary of this interaction would be economists. Let me explain why I say that. From the beginning, science fiction has been a very powerful way for us to imagine alternative realities in which very different technologies have changed our institutions and thereby individuals, forcing us to rethink the assumptions about institutions and individuals that we take for granted in analyzing the world. So, for example, countless dystopian science fictions depict a world in which the destruction of modern technologies by some disaster has destroyed modern institutions such as state, democracy, the ban on the caste system or moral norms restraining aggressive or apathetic behavior by individuals. And you have lots of examples of the excellent science fictions along the line. When the technological retrogression is most frequently the result of a nuclear war, like in the John Wyndham's The Chrysalis, Philip Reeves' Mortal Engine, or the Ghibli animation, the Nausicaa. But it can also be other man-made disasters like the depletion of oil and climate change, like in David Mitchell's Bone Clocks. Yeah? Almost invariably in these alternative worlds, life is very harsh because the destruction of modern institutions have made people closer to the self-seeking rationalists that are idealized in free market economics. The most extreme example of this being Mad Max movies. Yeah, yeah. So this is what you get when you take neoclassical economics to the extreme. Of course, more science fictions depict a world in which technologies are far more advanced than what they are when they were written. Yeah? But of course, that makes it very interesting to look at science fictions from the past, because sometimes the kind of prediction of technological progress is so like outdated. It's actually a bit embarrassing. Yeah? Indeed, for many people, this is the whole point of science fiction. That is exploring how more advanced science and technology change social institutions and human nature, or imagining an alien world in which our usual assumptions about human institutions and moralities do not hold, because they have completely different and typically more advanced technologies. Eh? But unlike what many economists would say, most of these science fictions that describe a world with advanced technologies do not say that these technologically more advanced worlds are actually better. And we are not even talking about worlds in which technologies are so advanced that they get out of human control and destroy the humanity, yeah? Like the Terminator or the Matrix. Yeah? Many of these science fictions tell us that even when superior technologies are apparently serving humans better in some ways, they can make people unhappier because they have been developed on a faulty understanding of human nature. So I don't know how many of you have read this novel. It's called Play a Piano. It was published in 1951 by the American science fiction writer Kurt Vonnegut. And yeah, if you're interested in whether robots are going to, take your jobs away, you should read this. Yeah. Back in 1951, he wrote about this world where basically he imagined that all industrial processes have been automated, yeah? Using what we would call now computer numerical control. Yeah? So no one has to work, yeah? And everyone has enough to have a comfortable life. Yeah? So that should, at least according to neoclassical economics, should have made everyone ecstatic. Yeah? Because you have high income, you have unlimited leisure time. Yeah? What's not to like? Yeah? But most people in this world are miserable, yeah? Because they don't have purpose in life. Yeah? They feel useless. Yeah? except for a tiny band of managers and engineers, no one has social views. So Vonnegut is implicitly saying that actually work is not just this utility that people have to put up with so that they can earn money with which they can consume things, which is in neoclassical economics the ultimate goal of life. He's saying that work has inherent value. It's about your self-fulfillment. It's about feeling useful for the society. Or think about the Brave New World by Huxley. In that world, the development of human cloning and other reproductive technologies has enabled the humanity to control its numbers, reducing resource demand. So if you like degrowth. It is also a world in which the manipulation of subconsciousness has made people A, hold cost appropriate ideas, thereby guaranteeing social peace, and B, adopt extreme consumerist culture that ensures high levels of demand. So there will be no secular stagnation. Lucas would have said that, yeah, that world has solved the problem of depression prevention. So this world, which is arguably a modern neuroeconomist paradise, should be a very happy world, but no one's happy. Take another similar example. This the movie by the writer and director Andrew Niccol, who also wrote the script for the Truman Show, Gattaca. This movie depicts a world where the developments of genetics and reproductive technologies have put the humanity on the cusp of weeding out genetically imperfect people. So it is a world in which talent is almost perfectly matched with people's jobs, but it is a horrible world in which genetically imperfect people are not even allowed to try for better things. In other words, Brave New World and Gattaca are saying that being imperfect, being not totally predictable, and having free will are key features of our humanity. They are saying that we actually don't want a perfect world, if that means destruction of our very humanity. Now, an interesting extension of the idea that science fiction is a way to imagine another economic world is to say that history is a dystopian science fiction without even memories of advanced technologies. In the past, largely because we have different technologies, economic institutions are different. And because economic institutions are different, people are different. Individuals may have free will, but what they are, what they want, what they can imagine are deeply shaped by the technologies and the institutions that they live under. If you have different technologies and different institutions, you have different people. This is why when there are poor old nations that are rich today were criticized for having lazy, dishonest, and irrational people. So this is, well, of all people, an Australian going to Japan and saying that the Japanese are lazy. This is the American missionary, who lived in Japan. Actually, this guy was not your typical kind of the Victorian racist, because he lived in Japan for like 25 years. He was fluent in Japanese language. He actually, when he returned to America 25 years later, became an advocate of the human rights of Japanese Americans. But even he had to say, well, Japanese are easygoing and emotional people. Oh, and that I love this. This is the worst thing that anyone ever said about anyone. You know, Beatrice Webb, the so-called proto-feminist and one of the founders of Fabian socialism. Yeah, this university. Huh? Going to Korea and calling my ancestors 12 million dirty, degraded, sullen, lazy, and religionless savages. Yeah? But even the Germans, you know, when Germany was poor, and you know the rhythm of life, because obvious that basically the agrarian nature was much slower, and then people are kind of cheating all the time because they were desperate. English people would go to Germany and say, these are very lazy, stupid, yeah, irrational people. Almost the opposite of the racial stereotype of Germans today, as organized, efficient, emotionless people. Yeah, I mean, this sums it all. Mary Shelley, she had a fight with her coach driver when she was traveling in Germany and wrote in a diary, Germans never hurry. Who would have believed that? Anyway, by showing this, I'm not advocating a strictly materialist view in which technologies define institutions and institutions define individuals. I mean, this was the Marxist view of the world. The causalities are much more complex. Individuals may be formed by technologies and institutions, but they also change them. Institutions influence how technologies are used and changed. So for example, one influential group of Marxists in the 1970s, like Stephen Marglin and Harry Braverman, argued that capitalists would deliberately change technologies that make control of workers easier rather than actually more efficient. Yeah? So that's the kind of thing that you could think about. Yeah? Technologies may set ultimate boundaries to the institutions that you can afford, but there's a lot of room for diversity depending on how individuals exercise their agencies. Yeah? So if you understand history in this way, you can very easily see that economic realities that we believe to be outcomes of some timeless scientific natural iron laws are really the results of the interactions between technology, institutions, politics, and individual agency. And used in this way, historical research becomes similar to writing and analyzing science fiction, except that the alternative realities are not as much imagined as in science fiction. Now, please note that I have just said not as much imagine rather than not imagine, because the recording and the deciphering of history also involve important elements of imagination. Yeah? We, as modern historians, backward project our perceptions, our values in kind of reading off from historical record the motivations of historical actors. We have to imagine some of the unwritten social rules that may not be apparent from the historical text, and so on. So, I mean, the historical research also involves imagination. But, there is that clear similarity there. Finally, there's this British novelist called L.P. Hartley, who wrote this book called Go Between, which I have not read. But he famously in the book said, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. I think it's a very apt remark. So if you say one of the utilities of studying history is to allow us to imagine other realities, you can say the same about studying foreign countries or doing comparative studies. Because when the foreign countries are a country with very different technologies, the comparison almost becomes a historical study if you are looking at it from the viewpoint of technologically more advanced country. So if you are comparing, say, Denmark with Uganda, and the day that looking at Uganda in technological terms will be kind of looking at history, whereas if you are looking at it from Uganda to Denmark, it's almost like science fiction. You are imagining, you are looking at the world with far more advanced technologies. And of course, the famous science fiction writer Arthur Clarke said, sufficiently advanced technologies is indistinguishable from magic. So and if you see it from the point of view of the researcher conducting the comparative study, it is like traveling in a time machine, the ultimate science fiction fantasy. Okay, so let me sum up. So in trying to understand the economy and reform it for the better, we can be immensely helped by science fiction, the study of history, and comparative studies, because they allow us to see, first of all, that the existing economic and social order is not a natural one. If you just look at your own society, it may feel completely natural, but if you imagine a different world through science fiction, if you look at another world through comparative study or history, you will see that it's not natural. These science fiction, history, and comparative studies also tell us that these economic and social orders can be changed. They have been changed. And most importantly, that they have been changed in the way they have only because some people dare to imagine a different world and fought for it. Thank you.
Thanks, thanks, Ha-Joon. That was a lot to take in. Sinead, comment on all of that in 5 minutes. Why don't you?
Hi everyone. Yeah, so I have the questionable privilege, difficulty of reacting immediately to all of that. So hopefully you can take this few minutes to digest and think of the kinds of things you'd like to talk on. I think I'd like to make a couple of quick points, I guess, before we head into the Q&A. And as separate to that, actually, one of the things I was thinking of. There we go, too short then. All right. As somebody wave at me. So I think one of the things I would say off the bat actually is I, as a utopian thinker, would say that what you've just done is a science fictional intervention in terms of if we think about the relationship between these disciplines. I think that interdisciplinarity, for example, is sort of thrown around as a bit of a buzzword, an institutional or management piece of jargon in higher education. And I think what we've done here is look at the ways in which science fictional thinking provides a way of imagining otherwise, expressing otherwise. It gives a different kind of grammar or lexicon to a particular discipline and introduces it in a way that can be familiar, where it was previously strange to people who might not be economists like me. So I think as a practice, that's something that we can introduce as a matter of thinking and creativity. I think it's a way of us reflecting on the neoliberal academy, the neoliberalization, the isolation of different disciplines in higher education. And I could talk forever about that, so I won't. But I think briefly I would make a couple of points about what I think of as the two major positions that Ha-Joon has taken. The second of which I might be briefer on, because I think the audience might have thoughts on that, which is this idea of economists believing that progress in science might be a kind of catch-all solution, or could virtually, solve all economic problems if it were advanced enough. And I think that's really, really interesting one to take up. And I have a lot of thoughts about how that relates to our ideas of capitalism and work. And I think science fiction is a really good tool with which to deconstruct ideas of labor. So I'm sure other people probably have strong opinions about that also. I think you've raised really interesting questions about ideologies of progress, how we arrive at the idea of progress, and how economists kind of perceive their own discipline within that idea of progress. And I think I would like us to talk a little bit about, I suppose, the centrality of risk and abundance in the different examples of science fiction that you brought up. One of the examples I thought of actually was another Andrew Niccol film, In Time, if you've seen that, majestically with very strange casting of Justin Timberlake in the lead role. But yeah, I think that idea of biopolitical control is really closely related to the themes of capitalism and labor that we brought up, and even the racialized capital that you ended on there, I think comes through really strongly in something like that. But I think we can come back to looking at biopolitical control, and even circling back to your initial comments about Karl Marx looking at this as a problem of design almost. I think that we can come back to different examples of that. But given my own research area, I would spend a couple of minutes, I think, on your first position, the first position of the two, which is this idea that economists believe they're practicing a kind of science. Science fiction authors love to do that too. I've kind of historically loved to do that as well. I think around the kind of 70s, a lot of the leading authors and a lot of the kind of leading theorists in the genre really tried to position science fiction as somehow separate to like classical fiction in this way, in order to sort of legitimate the genre. So it adopted vocabulary of science in order to legitimate the idea that science fiction has quote unquote importance or significance. So I think that's something that actually inheres in the history of both disciplines in a really interesting way. And a kind of the relationship with sort of commercial production comes through and resonates between the two. I would argue maybe in the Ward Moore example that that's maybe an alternative history, and here's where you get into like whether genre distinctions are important. And I don't know about the degree to which it matters if science fiction authors are very exact about their economics. I'm interested in what people think about that. There's an author I like called Jo Lindsay Walton who was asked about this in an interview I read a little while back. Why don't more science fiction authors spend time on the detail, on the realism or the rigor of their economic systems? And he was like, well, I don't know how much they want to know or read economics. And I think that's a bit unfair. But he also pointed out that it's possibly not convincing to some authors and readers that economics is telling the truth in the same way maybe that, for example, physics might be perceived to do. So I think you brought up a really interesting kind of conundrum here about what kind of truth telling we can look at when we put economics and science fiction in conversation with one another. That has really been a problem for science fiction as well, where I think this idea of what kind of truth telling is happening and how much does it need to relate to real science has been a part of the genre. But I think if we look at more post-colonial iterations of science fiction, it really positions science fiction as a kind of not a genre engine producing kind of effects, more so as a way of thinking, a kind of awareness of science fictionality, and a way of kind of framing and testing experiences from different vantage points. And I think where you ended your talk really spoke specifically to the problem of vantage point when we're looking at ideas of scale and complexity. So one of the things I was thinking of, I'm not sure how much time we have. 2 minutes? I'll give you a very brief example from my own area of study. So one of the things that science fiction has been lauded for is the idea to predict and forecast, to tell the future, to figure out what's going to happen before it does. And that often comes as a result of its relationship with economics. There's an interesting example from my area of study called Utopia. It's a novella called Utopia by an Egyptian author called Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq. And he interestingly cites his two major sources as Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and a text by an economist I had never heard of called Whatever Happened to the Egyptians by Galal Amin is the author's name. So the text is about the kind of open door or infitah policies in Egypt in the 1970s and the different sociological changes that kind of imposed upon the economic system in Egypt, kind of dramatic and quick effects, where life really. And Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq uses that classic utopian trope of a gated community, or sorry, of an enclave, to create the idea of a gated community, in order to sort of fill in the gaps where some of the kind of ideas of scale or range or collections of data that he perceived as being part of that text, and kind of fill in those gaps around human experience and perception that weren't a part of it. So I'll give you a quick example from the book about it. Yeah, so one of the critics that I work with kind of identified the issue as being this. So in Galal Amin's economic text, he treats the neoliberalization of the economy as a kind of neutral. So he treats human behavior as if it's the product of human nature, and that's something that you ended on there, except when it's necessary to treat humans as rational agents central to the mythology of liberal economics. He also treats social mobility as if it's necessarily a good thing, despite changing the meaning of the term so that it no longer refers to the possibility of vertical mobility, opening up to more people, but instead functions as a euphemism for the increased precarity of everyone and increasing the agonistic social field. I think that that kind of classic science fictional trope of haves and have-nots, and being able to look at things from multiple vantage points, comes through really strongly in a fictional text like Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq's, where it's doubly narrated from two different protagonists from either side of that skin, and kind of it makes kind of this dark irony out of really latching onto the idea of human nature as an economic variable. So I thought that was really kind of useful example to add to the ones that you've already offered us. But I think we're pressed for time, so let's stop there and hear from everybody else.
Great.
Sound like that?
Thanks. Now, one of the other things I should have said, as I say, we're trying to relearn how to do this thing live, is that this is on Zoom, so questions will be broadcast. And if you don't want to have your name attached and you're on Zoom, then just say, I want to remain anonymous, we'll read it out. If you're in the room, I guess you come and whisper in Anna's ear or someone's ear if you're worried about your question being public. I can't think on this topic it's going to be too controversial, but we'll see. So we're going to start with a round of questions in the room. Do we have mics upstairs and downstairs? Deepa?
Yeah.
We have a mic upstairs. Okay, so let's go upstairs first, because people always go downstairs first. So any hands up if you want to ask a question. People go upstairs because they want to do Facebook, don't they? This is or whatever. Yep, question there.
So I thought it was really interesting that one of the perspectives you brought forth was about how economists like to believe that science and technology, progress in science and technology will solve all our problems. And I'm wondering how that fits in currently with arguments around green growth and things like banking on progress in science and technology will help us decouple growth from, say, carbon emissions. So to what extent do you think that's a science fiction right now that's currently embodying the environment?
Right, chucking in a bomb, first one. Excellent. We'll take three and then we'll go to both speakers. Next, anybody else up in the upper gallery? No, let's go downstairs. Anyone? Yep, got a question here. Deepa, you're gonna have to run around, sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Ha-Joon Chang. And I'm a co-founder of the LSE Sci-Fi Society. And meanwhile, I'm also a student of Justin Lin. So, Justin Hayes. And that's why I heard you a lot previously. And my question is, it seems the post-Khrushchev Soviet sci-fi writers are very technocratic and on the other hand, very utopian, such as the Strugatsky brothers and the writer of the Roadside Picnic. And they all have the view that with the proper management of the social relation and resources, it is possible in achieving a high life quality and egalitarian society. That is basically, in their view, a communism. And meanwhile, the current stream of the cyberpunk fictions would portray a grim, dark future for most of the people with the extreme rich on the other side. And that is all because the government or governing is missing. So in your view, would you say that technology or even AI should be adopted in the daily governing? And should we have to maintain a bigger and bigger government in order to coping with the problem of ungoverned capital and technology? Thank you.
Wow. Okay. This is top questions. Anybody else? I think those two could keep us going all day, but let's say one more. No? Okay. Yeah, we got one. Yep, one at the back.
I have a kind of comment / question. One of the things that kind of struck me as I was listening to you is that especially this idea that the past is a foreign place. And when I think about all of the kind of examinations of what things that are kind of dark and that we're worried about as a society, we seem to need to have an alternative reality to explore them, right? Whether it's in the past or the present or foreign countries. You know, we seem to be okay at exploring really dark things if it's in an alternative reality. But a lot of the things that are exploring like our present, we seem to require them to be happy and bright and aspirational. So I wonder, like, is that a barrier for us taking them seriously? You know, the kind of exoticization of gloom. And could we imagine, you know, alternatives that are actually sunny or examine, you know, is it too difficult for us to focus on the dark topics that are actually within our realities? You know, would people be willing to read a book or to watch a film that's that dark? There's a kind of paradox there.
Okay, those three questions have got to be some best three questions I've ever sat through up here. Who wants to take?
Huh?
You got this.
Okay. Yeah.
Take it.
Yeah, green growth. You know, well, once again, I mean, I don't believe in. However, quickly the technology that actually develops in terms of renewable energy or the reduction in material use, I don't think that will completely solve the problem. Yeah? Because there'll always be question of you know, unless you believe in the Marxist utopia where things are so plenty, there's no distribution struggle at all, and whatever little struggle there is will be managed by benevolent central planning authority. You know, there always be the question of the distribution. So, I mean, even if you open up greater kind of planetary space by inventing better technologies, who's going to take advantage of that? Yeah. So is it going to be the rich countries who have the technologies, or is it going to be the poor countries who need to grow? Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I think a very good example to think about this proposal for degrowth. Yeah. So I mean, there are different forms of degrowth, but if it's in the form that, you know, rich countries need to shrink so that, you know, poorer countries can develop. You know, I actually happen to agree with most of what that group says, but there's no realistic political chance that we will have that kind of the arrangement. Yeah. So no, I mean, you could still argue for this alternative arrangement, but, you know, do we then say, okay, we are not going to achieve anything until something like the world socialist revolution happens? Yeah, because anything that is short of this fundamental degrowth is not acceptable. Or do we say, you know, that we have to somehow come up with technologies and the policy proposals that would be accepted and then make some difference? Yeah, so there's the ultimate dilemma there. Yeah, I mean, I must confess that I have only read couple of the books by Stugarsky, the brothers, Roadside Picnic, and what's it called, the Dead Man's, yeah. So I cannot really comment on the Soviet era science fiction, but yes, I mean, I think, you know, whether it is pure material technology or kind of social arrangements or institutions, I don't believe that there's sorry, it is possible to somehow come up with the ultimate benevolent algorithm and just let it run kind of by an AI. Huh? I mean, no, in a way, I mean, that was the Soviet dream, wasn't it? Yeah. So you create a classless society where everything will be rationally managed. Yeah, there'll be no waste, no conflict. Everyone will get what they deserve. Yeah, as a human being. Yeah, but you know, in reality, that didn't work like that. Exactly because people wanted different things. Yeah, according to how the society evolved. Yeah, so yeah, maybe it was okay that to kind of give everyone the same thing that when you know that they just were emerging out of the Second World War, but by the 60s, you know, that people wanted different things. You know, they wanted I don't know, different colors of shoes. Yeah, they wanted different types of bread, and you know that they just couldn't deliver that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, by the way, if anybody's wondering who Big Brother here is, it's David Lewis. I don't know quite why he's up there, but anyway, in the spirit of 1984, David Lewis is watching you. Okay, right, carry on.
I find this discussion really interesting. And actually, before I answer the third one, I think, yeah, you've kind of both actually hit on a really interesting point, which runs throughout your talk as well, which is kind of this paradoxical position the state takes in a lot of futures imagining, right? Where it's sort of like the state is something to be discarded, to be disdained, but also something that is necessary for like regulation, and to actually have like a structure, like a blueprint for any of the things that we make thinkable. So I think more thought experiments, more discussions about thought experiments that we could get into would be good. But I really liked your question and that last one. I think it made me think. So the broader context of a lot of my work has engaged a little bit with this. Where sorry, I'm not near enough.
That one's for you.
And it was something that actually I picked up on when part of your talks spoke about memories as well, about kind of dystopian imaginaries as relating to memory, collective memory, for example. So there's a visual artist I was just telling you about that I'm working on, a Palestinian visual artist who reimagines what it's like, what it would be like to think of the archive as an imaginary archive, or if you could doctor archival processes. She has a really interesting kind of short film and piece of installation work on archaeology, which imagines the idea that this Palestinian subject in kind of an unspecified time is able to use carbon dating to change the temporality of particular artifacts and bury them in the landscape to kind of reorient the idea of what is the relationship between time and historiography and nationhood. And it's all extremely bleak. The subject matter is deeply bleak, but what becomes quite interesting when she speaks about it is the kind of paratext around the whole thing and how it's presented and digested and how it's marketed for different audiences. And she said, I think she says this herself, one of the reasons that it's been so successful is, and I'm using her words, she said there's an expectation of her work to be quote unquote third worldy, to have a kind of graininess to it, to kind of, you know, really trade only in the bleakness of the subject matter. And instead her aesthetics are really, you know, they're like CGI sophisticated, they're very sleek, it's very futuristic, it's very humorous. She uses a lot of humor and satire in it, and she said that's just not really what audiences are expecting given the kind of political and broader context of the subject matter, but it kind of uses that science fictional dynamic of what is familiar and what is strange to people and kind of assumes certain perceptions and does so successfully. So I think in a lot of the work that I've encountered, because it's being sort of circulated and read and encountered in in translation and in audiences that are less familiar with some of the context, it actually has an exoticizing effect that is, it kind of shows up these problems in the genre and how they're presented, but it also is something that a lot of the creators harness to sort of, to create a greater audience for their work. So I think that dynamic is really fascinating.
Okay. Anybody next round? Or have we got someone on Zoom? We got someone.
So
on Zoom.
I've got one on Zoom and a quick comment, and also just to flag, we've got 10 minutes left and we do need to be out of the room. So I'm
Oh, do we?
quick.
Yes,
So
boss.
this
Sorry.
this one comes from Hannah Forst. She says, from the lecture I understood, Professor Chang thinks science fiction.
Sorry, can't catch you. You're gonna.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So from the lecture I understood, Professor Chang thinks science fiction can be a way to imagine alternative futures. For example, a future in which technological advances have not brought the expected promises. My counter argument, science fiction has been there for some time, especially regarding technology, but so far I don't see that many of these dystopias have come true. How would Ha-Joon comment on this? Then I've got another, that was Hannah Forst. I've got one comment, not a question, from Leland de la Cruz, who says, Ha-Joon misses out on the economic imagination of Star Trek, an economy where replicators can make something out of virtually nothing, except you need minerals for the replicators. Picard says, because there's no more money, people can focus on bettering themselves and exploring space, but this reinforces the point that technology sets the conditions of human possibility.
Okay. And any more in the room? No. Yes, one there, Peter. Thanks, everybody on Zoom.
I don't know if it's an appropriate last question, but could it be said that science fiction where humans are overtaken by robots represents two contrasting sides of capitalism? Because because on one hand, the idea of robots really appeals to the progress and efficiency side of it, because robots don't need food, don't need sleep, don't need many of the things that we need. But on the other hand, precisely because they don't need all of these things, it goes against the consumerism side of capitalism. So where does we're going to be overtaken by artificial intelligence fit in a broader economic sort of narrative, if that makes sense?
Yep. I think growth versus well-being seems like a perfect place to end. Okay, so do you want to take one? Any one of those?
Sure. I think that last question is interesting. I think like techno dystopias in particular engage with that dynamic. The thing is, and actually I think some of the examples that you have addressed this is like science fiction is really good at choosing what Darkus Uvin, a theorist who kind of set the initial kind of definition of what science fiction is, which has been hotly contested, but for the purposes of this conversation, kind of suggested that science fiction texts introduce what's called a novum. So it's just a novelty into the narrative text, and by text I mean visual, narrative, whatever. That causes a sort of a shift, and we have to ask then, okay, what does this change? What other changes does this change make possible? And I think a lot of techno dystopias focus still too much on historically, if we think of even cyberpunk, I think historically they still focus too much on narrow vantage points around kind of who is benefiting from what technologies, who are they, who has access to them, who's responsible for the supply chain, for example. So I'm just thinking a lot. Actually, I was recently watching Children of Men, if you've ever seen that, and I think it's a really good. It's a film directed by Alfonso Cuarón that's adapted from a novel, and it does a really good job of engaging with debates around reproductive technologies, but ultimately kind of fails in its exploits because the whole film maps these issues around reproductive futurity from the vantage point of like a white privileged man in this future where almost nobody has anything. And then the kind of the reproductive future of this post-apocalyptic world sits with a black female character who almost doesn't speak throughout the whole film. And I think that a lot of techno dystopias still engage in that kind of privation of resource, a kind of scarcity mentality. But we could think about something like The Dispossessed as a way outside of some of those limited parameters, I reckon. Yeah,
they're doing that thing of looking through the door and going, oh, and shutting it again, which is really annoying.
Yeah, so I'd be very quick. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the dystopian picture depicted in the many science fictions haven't come true, but you know, I don't think that the prediction is really the point of science fiction. Yeah, although as Sinéad said, some people take it that way. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just an imaginary device. I mean, looking back, you know, I was born in 1963, and when I was a kid, all these boys magazine. I mean, according to them, but by 1999, everyone will be driving in flying cars, and your meal will be 3 pills. Yeah, I would have committed suicide to live in a world like that. Yeah, because I like eating. Yeah, yeah, I mean, I think that it was still, yeah, a useful device in kind of making people think about the different realities. Yeah, the last the question, I don't know. I mean, for me, yeah, actually, I talk about that in this new book. You know, the history of capitalism has been history of automation. Yeah, so this in some ways, nothing that new about AI. Yeah? We hear about this so much because it's now going to automate things that people who write about these things do. Yeah? So they are going to get rid of professors. Yeah? They are going to get rid of lawyers, yeah, management consultants. Yeah, that's only why that we are hearing so much about jobs disappearing. Yeah, think about it. For the last 250 years, everything has been automated if possible. Yeah, but we still haven't run out of jobs. Yeah. This time around, we are worried about jobs so much because now the journalists, the professors, management consultants, they are going to lose the jobs. Yeah. So I think there's a bit of class hypocrisy there. My view is that jobs can be socially created. Yeah. I mean, if you, yeah, for example, introduce a rule that you know, given the care crisis that you are having in this country, yeah, if you introduce a legislation that vastly increases number of care workers per old people, per children, and so on, you know, you will create a lot of jobs. Yeah, I mean, jobs are not determined by technologies. Yeah, I mean, you can't change this. Yeah. Anyway, let me.
Oh, can I make one recommendation?
Sure.
I totally agree. And a person I found really great by thinking about this is David Graeber. If anybody's read David Graeber's book,
Oh yeah.
really, and he makes a very similar point that over many decades, like the kind of distribution of types of labor hasn't really changed. Like there's the same amount of people working in the service industry, even though we've got all this technological advances. And he talks a lot about how we could kind of reimagine economic distribution by thinking about just jobs differently. And it's really great.
Okay. Thank you. We've got to get out. Next week is Rafif Ziadah, a Palestinian scholar and poet and a brilliant speaker. So do come back this time next week. Ha-Joon will be, his book will be on Book of the Week all next week on BBC Radio 4. Fizzing with ideas today. Lots to listen about to back on YouTube. Please give them all a big round of applause.
Wait.
Thanks, Hard. Thanks to Sinead Murphy. Thanks to Ha-Joon Chang. And please leave the room as fast as possible. Thank you very much.
Friday, isn't it?
Sorry? Yeah.
Sorry about the rush.
Yeah, we got a few things to sort out. But never mind.
Yeah.
It was always going to be like that, first one.